Hello and welcome to the Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today I'm looking at the 2020 to 2021 series Far Sector from DC's Young Animal imprint. This probably sounds like both a weird flex and an incoherent tangent, but when I first heard My Chemical Romance in the early 2000s on whatever random $5 punk compilation I had most recently purchased way back in the medieval days of dial-up internet when that was the best way of finding new punk and punk-adjacent music, my only thought before skipping the song, probably about a minute into it, was something along the lines of, well, they aren't going to last. Yes, I can be kind of a music snob, and yeah, boy was I wrong. Similarly, when MCR's frontperson Gerard Way first started appearing on comic books on my radar, like their creator-owned series Umbrella Academy, the Penny Parker Edge of Spider-Verse comic, and my beloved Doom Patrol, I similarly dismissed this, assuming that no one was going to follow Gerard Way on what I probably inwardly assumed was some sort of ego trip into a territory in which they didn't belong. But again, I was super wrong, and probably good that I was, because Way's career in comics has by all accounts been a successful one, even leading to Way heading up DC's Young Animal imprint. It's difficult to say exactly what the Young Animal imprint is supposed to be, other than an excuse for DC to basically release some titles that don't exactly fit with normal continuity or appeal to their regular audience. In other words, it's basically just regular comics that they probably wanted to have a convenient excuse ready for if they didn't sell well. Or maybe I'm just being cynical. Whatever the case, one such comic Way had an idea for to release on Young Animal was one called Far Sector. The idea was the comic would feature a singular Green Lantern character lost on some sci-fi adventure out in a sector beyond the jurisdiction set by the Guardians of the Universe. Not necessarily part of continuity, but not necessarily separate from it either. To tell this story, Way hired award-winning science fiction author N.K. Jemisin, apparently impressed with her novels. I've said in past videos that I'm not a huge fan of bringing novelists in to write comic books because it's not an easy medium to write for and so not a simple transition to make. It often takes time to develop the mindset to write for comics, and one miniseries is often not the place to do that. But as I did research for all the other Green Lantern comics I'm covering this year, I came across this title time and time again, and finally decided to give it a chance, and it just felt like this was the perfect time to cover it. So let's see if I can overcome my bias and if this comic can deliver as we open this up and take this away. The comic opens on some murder. And on a quote. Yep, it's gonna be one of those comics. Literally every issue is going to start with a quote. Oh boy, I freaking hate when comics do that. But also it seems to be my favorite creators who mostly feel the need to do it. Like Jim Starlin on every post-Infinity Gauntlet comic he wrote for Marvel. Or Genevieve Valentine in her honestly fantastic run on the New 52 Catwoman. So, not sure really if I consider this a good or a bad sign. Both, I guess? For this first issue, our main character is giving us the quote, as she gives us some very noir-style dialogue as she stands in a very noir-style nighttime rainstorm in a very noir-style alleyway in a very noir-style city. Yes, I'm just trying to say the word noir a lot. Noir. Noir. It's French, you know? Our Green Lantern here, in her super retro cool design, gives us the hardened noir hero deadpan while the local cops around her freak the F out. Because they're not used to dealing with murder. They're not used to dealing with violent crime at all, in fact. And if you're wondering why you're learning that in this way, it's because, like with any good noir, this story is told egregiously out of order. So let me try and get it straight for you. Well, maybe straight isn't the word to use. Let me tell it in more of a chronological order. Our story is set in a sector of the universe with no number. The reason they give for this is that it's outside of the Guardian's normal jurisdiction, as I said in the intro. So those of you who didn't skip it know that already. Yeah, I'm calling out ya skippers. Ya skippy boys. Stop skipping things. But I'm not sure this whole concept actually makes any sense. As most any longtime Green Lantern fan would know, there aren't any sectors that have no number because they're outside of the Guardian's jurisdiction. As Coach Gardner explained to us in Green Lantern Corps number 1, the typical concept is that the Guardians divided the universe like a giant pie chart, with all sectors meeting together at Oa, making Oa the center of the universe, and the entire rest of the universe, logic would dictate, therefore under their purview. But despite nerdily actuallying them, this is information we're only given by the main character, and there might be more reasons why this is both true and not a contradiction of established continuity, but I'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about Romulus and Remus. Okay, that's not actually the names of these two planets here, I'm not sure they even are given names. But the idea is that in this faraway sector of the universe, we have two planets where two biological races organically developed. On one planet, we have the Na, and yes, as far as I can tell, that is pronounced Na, as in like Nah Dog. The Na are an extremely humanoid race with elf ears and super cool bat wings and an obsession with military face paint. That last part might not be accurate. On the other planet was the Ketopli, I think is how that's said. A race of sentient carnivorous plants. Or sentient carnivorous plants for you weirdos out there, you know who you are. They're like thinking Venus flytraps, but for people. Venus people traps. I'll keep working on that. But also apparently they find the eating of people to be an almost religious level of experience. Then there's actually a third race, a race of artificial intelligent beings that mostly live on this sector's version of the internet called the AT-AT, which might be a reference to the giant walkers in Star Wars and a stupid little play on the little A symbol you see in emails. So hopefully we never stop calling that the @ symbol so future generations don't get confused AF when reading this comic. I mean, it's not uncommon for symbols like that to get name changes. We can't even all agree on this planet what to call it. I mean, fun fact, apparently in Russia they call that symbol dog, or really sabaka, which is their word for dog I guess, because they apparently thought it looked like a dog. I don't know what kind of dog has a tail that freaking long, but okay, Russia, okay. The AT-AT eat creativity, essentially, thriving on the original thoughts that can only come from biological races, and that mostly is in the form of memes because this comic is coming out in 2020. Nothing about the AT-AT really makes sense to me. Like, why did they develop their name as a derivative of an Earth term on an American term for a symbol that wouldn't have existed thousands of years ago when this species supposedly came into existence? And why would they be so obsessed with Earth memes specifically? Where would they even be getting these if they're supposedly so far, far away that even the Guardians of the Universe don't go near this planet? The race is just so weirdly and completely defined by a late 2010s understanding of the internet. That would be fine, I guess, if this was Earth's future, or a future really of any kind that could allow for an Earth-based influence to have somehow reached out across the stars. But this is contemporary. It makes no sense. In a long ago time, somehow even longer ago than dial-up internet, an alien race called the Cloud Cryptocracy came in and, as outside conquerors tended to do, just as the narration points out for us, they messed shit up. As the new ruling class of these planets, the Cryptocracy got the three races so busy fighting each other that they didn't realize that the real problem was coming from their new rulers. And this led to a war so drastic that both planets were utterly destroyed, and the three races also wiped out the Cloud Cryptocracy in revenge. So for a time, their civilization lived on spaceships, to the point that the people gained surnames based on the spaceship their family lived on. Eventually though, they would create the City Enduring, a giant floating space city where they all could live together again. It was sometime during this Lost in the Desert period that the races apparently decided that their emotions could only lead to more destruction, and they needed to do something about them. So something called the emotion exploit was created, and now all people of all three races live without emotion. Or without much emotion, I guess. They still seem to feel things to a small extent, and they're still able to express emotion, but largely those expressions are considered to be performative, and don't always correctly match the emotion they're supposed to be conveying. While the emotion exploit was supposed to be something that was decided on, as we eventually learn, it was apparently instead unleashed like a virus on the populace. but rather than fight it, they all ended up accepting it, to the point that the entirety of their social, economic, and political structures are built around it. It literally becomes against the law in their society to be emotional, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, just goes super well. At some point, a drug is created called Switch Off, so named because it literally switches the emotion exploit off, so that people on the drug can feel emotion again for as long as the effects last. But despite that, the emotion exploit is effective enough to largely end crime, or at least violent crime, on their planet. It's been, they say, 500 years since a murder took place. Until the one that opens up our comic, where a Nah named Steven is murdered by a Catopli named Mullein. Maybe he was murdered for having the super cool space name of Steven. So that brings us to our Green Lantern. Her name is Sojourner Mullein, which we don't actually even learn until she talks to us directly in the second issue while cosplaying as Morpheus from The Matrix. Because she's a super nerd. Like, even on this far-off distant planet she's only theoretically temporarily staying on, she apparently bothered to bring her anime figurines with her. And her super awesome, totally not a Funko Pop Jon Stewart figure. I gotta get me one of those. Look how freaking cute he is! That's how you know he's not a Funko Pop, because it's not ugly AF. Ooh, sick burn on Funko. Get him! Sojourner, who goes by Joe, is obviously named for Sojourner Truth, a former slave who became an abolitionist and women's rights activist and just all-around important figure in American history. That is going to be important because this comic is largely going to be about current events on our own planet, even though it will actually be events happening on an alien planet. This isn't unique to this story, by the way, that's just science fiction. War of the Worlds was criticism of European imperialism, and The Time Machine was about the inevitable destructiveness of capitalism. Preachy politicism is just what sci-fi is. Jo entered into adulthood in the military, hoping that would give her the chance to make the world a better place. But the reality of what the military did in foreign countries quickly shattered that dream, so she returned to America and became a cop, still hoping she could do something good in the world. That dream lasted until the day her partner beat some guy to death, or near enough to it, for presumably the crime of being black. She reported him to her superiors, and that got her fired. This is when a female guardian, vaguely in disguise as a weirdly beautiful blue alien lady, decides to randomly pick Jo, of all people, to be an experimental new Green Lantern. She gives Jo a ring that charges on its own just whenever it's not in use and sends her out to the city Enduring, who had just requested a Green Lantern to help them deal with their problems, something the other Guardians were, I guess, ignoring. We get some side information from the Guardians at the start of several of the issues as these sort of formal written reports about the city Enduring, showing that the area actually is under watch by the Guardians. So it not having a sector name may be more due to Jo simply not being an actual member of the Green Lantern Corps with an actual ring belonging to the Corps, and thus not having formal training or any connection to inform her about what sector she's in. Which explains what I was saying earlier about how it not having a sector could still work within established continuity. It's not that it doesn't have a sector number, she just doesn't know what it is. Jo arrived at the city Enduring shortly after the first murder in 500 years, as I've said before, but that's not really why she's there. She's there because the rulers of Enduring, a council of 3 made up of 1 member of each race, are concerned that there is going to be essentially a pandemic of murders now that Switch Off has hit the streets. And it seems they're right to be worried, because when Jo goes to interview her murder suspect, Mullein, she finds the Catopli woman already assassinated. Ugh, gross. Amazing what art you can get away with by just making the blood not red. Jo chases Mullein's murderer, but quickly loses them due to poor control over her still new power ring and her apparent fear of flying. And fear in using green power rings have never been good bedfellows. Jo's problems only get worse when a protest suddenly erupts in the city on 2 fronts. One is a group demanding that Switch Off be legalized and that people be allowed to have emotions again. And the other is a group that considers these people to be dangerous criminals who are going to bring their civilization back to the state it was in when they destroyed their home planets. Jo tries to help calm the protests before things get too out of hand, but she's undermined by the council, who just decide to have the cops fire on the protesters simply for protesting. Not obviously drawing connections to events in 2020 here or anything. Certainly not. Especially with the way that Joe here says, "not again," even though this hasn't happened yet in the city enduring. At least not that we've seen. Joe stops the cops and quells the ensuing riot, and by the end we learn that the protest was started by the wife of Steven, the man murdered at the beginning of the story. You know, the one with the super cool alien name. She believes Mullein murdered Steven because she was on switch off and being unused to emotion was unable to control her emotions, leading to her murdering a man. She also regrets not being able to grieve the loss of her husband. We also learn that these protests have happened in the city's past. 12 times to be exact. In each time, they were met with similar maximum force to shut them down, rather than simply listening to their complaints and changing policy. With Joe here now, the protesters are protected and even have a voice going directly to the council since, as you can probably guess, Joe is sympathetic to the side facing the greater oppression. But that seems to be exactly why the council invited her in the first place. Well, why 2 of the council members invited her. It seems the counselor, Blaze of Glory, never wanted outside interference at all, and Joe's presence was requested by the Catoply counselor, Averup Thorn, and the Naw counselor, Martha the Sea, by the Wavering Dark until the sun falls. Yes, that's his full name. Seems to be family, ship history, and class status. Full disclosure though, I totally kept forgetting that his name was Marth and seriously thought every single time that Joe's internal dialogue was making some weird Fire Emblem reference. See, should have actually been worrying about Roy, am I right, my fellow Smash Bros? Where was I? Thorn. The Catoply counselor has an affinity for the stranger in a strange land, which he shows by saying he wants to eat her. Which is a compliment coming from a carnivorous plant race, apparently. Thorn will eventually reveal to us that Mullein, the first murderer, was a vegetarian Catoply. Apparently, it's not easy for them, but they can manage it, and that makes her murdering Steven by eating him all that much more weird. I mean, weird from their perspective, not from our... you know what I mean. But while Thorn tries to investigate this, he's eventually turned into a meat puppet. That is to say, apparently the emotion exploit, being digital in nature, allows AT-ATs to essentially hack living people's brains. And Thorn, as well as a couple others, have this happen to them in an attempt to stop Joe's investigations, leading to her having a giant mech fight with him. Because I'm pretty sure you're not a real Green Lantern until you've used your constructs to have a giant mech fight. I don't know. Ask Kyle Rayner about that, maybe. When Joe realizes that this hack has killed her sort of friend slash potential ally, she uses her ring and her AT-AT assistant at ICANHasEarthStuff01, because again, nothing about the AT-AT makes any sense, especially their names, to take her consciousness into the digital world to catch the AT-AT meat hackers. And if you've been wondering why the hell I covered this comic, well, here's your answer. Right here. It's for this moment when CanHas, as she is called for short, makes this Leroy Jenkins reference. Yep, that's it. I'm all about those Leroy Jenkins references. This leads us to the discovery that there are essentially sweatshops full of workers on switch off to create memes and other creative influencer type things, and the workers are the indebted and unconnected. So our vegetarian Catoply, Mullein, went into debt because of her controversial diet, and was then forced onto switch off in one of these labor camps, attempted to escape, and was hacked into to murder a random person to distract from what was really happening to her. Then, since Joe showed up, Mullein was also murdered to try and hide what was going on even more. To make matters even crazier, Joe is able to trace the ownership of the camp she finds back to Counselor Roy. I mean Marth. You know what I mean. Which is maybe not surprising because Marth, we learned earlier, is hooked on Switch Off himself, using the drug to reflect on the colder, more logical decisions he made earlier in the day. So Joe has Marth arrested, and that's when things get really bonkers. Because with Thorn dead and Marth publicly embarrassed, the AT-AT counselor Blaze of Glory stages a coup. I'm still not entirely sure why. Best I can explain it is that the AT-AT have been a third-class race this entire time. They're people largely left starving or doing the most extremely menial task needed by the biologics, but otherwise left to rot in their digital city inside the servers of the City Enduring, since many can't even afford to materialize as holograms that can interact with biological people. So Blaze has decided that biologicals are the problems, and she's just going to wipe them all out by taking control of everything and turning the city's own defenses against itself. Themselves? Theirselves? Nope. I've confused myself on the pronouns there, not getting that back. Just moving on. Joe quickly stops Blaze by simply blocking her ability to materialize holographically inside the council chambers. Then she overcomes her fear of flight to fly up into space and talk the captains of the warships out of blowing up their own home. Marth is then released and installed as the leader of the City Enduring, leading to promises of ending the emotion exploits control and restructuring society and improved freedoms and access to holograms for the AT-AT. Joe and the local police chief rekindle a relationship they attempted before this story actually started, wanting to give it another go now that emotion can be part of the relationship. And it seems that Joe has decided to stay, at least for the time being, on the City Enduring instead of returning home. So the comic ends with Joe, for the first time, starting to recite the Green Lantern Oath, something she doesn't actually need to do, and I finally get to the breakdown. As you can probably tell, this comic is a little light on plot. Most of the comic is spent on character development and world building, which honestly is definitely the most interesting part of it, and save for the AT-AT, does it mostly pretty well. On the other hand, that does make it feel a little slow, especially in the early issues, which adds to the feel of being written by a sci-fi novelist, because as someone who's read a lot of sci-fi novels, I'm pretty used to that slow build-up in books. Of course, I don't feel it works as well in comics, but I don't feel it makes this series really suffer either. I'm not particularly drawn into any of the characters. All the alien characters are deliberately weird and off-putting, and Joe is very much a typical broody and snarky noir protagonist, which has definitely never been my favorite part about noir protagonists. But tons of lead comic characters are the same way. Her narration and personality remind me so much of the way Kyle Higgins wrote Nightwing during the New 52, and people seem to love that shit when males act that way, so I can't really see anyone finding Joe to be an unlikable character unless they're deliberately trying to have a problem with her. Probably due to her gender and/or race and/or sexuality. My biggest problems with this story then are two things. One is that it draws connections a bit too directly to our modern world or points them out in too much of a hand-holding kind of way. This isn't really a bad thing in its own right, but does tend to work more for those who are already sympathetic to the views expressed, while allowing those who aren't to write this kind of thing off as being preachy and use empty meaningless labels like SJWs or whatever to describe it. Even though it's not being preachy any more than literally anything else is, it's just saying things those people don't want to hear. A more subtle approach would make this less preaching to the choir and more drawing in diverse groups who need to hear this kind of story, but that's almost a stretch to fault the author because haters want to hate. The second, and my personal biggest problem with this comic, is the constant cringy meme references that make this feel like an adult trying to be down with the kids. But not really even because they're bad on their own accord, but because they're going to seriously date this comic. Which leaves me feeling that this comic reminds me immensely of Jon Stewart's first appearance. That is to say, in 50 years, some idiot like me may read this comic for the first time and be put off by just how dated it feels culturally, but also depressed by how still disappointingly relevant the political and cultural issues expressed in the comic are. Because, just like the City Enduring, our government and culture are remarkably resistant to the repeated complaints of the populace to fix the real problems and instead opt for easy answers to maintain the status quo, no matter how destructive those easy answers may be and how unsatisfying the status quo might be. But before I get too much on a soapbox here, let's all take a moment to appreciate just how freaking amazing Jamal Campbell's art is throughout the entire series, just like it always is. I will definitely follow this man for the rest of his freaking career. So I'm giving this series a recommendation level of high. Its faults are pretty minor, other than maybe being a little boring, but overall I think both sci-fi fans in general and Green Lantern fans specifically will be able to appreciate this unique spin on the mythos. The collected edition gets 1. Experimental Green Lantern Ring, which I'm going with being a good thing because we don't have a rainbow of rings to rank it against here. The collection features all 12 issues, meaning it's not light reading, and still makes room for a cover gallery, a big chunk of concept art from Campbell, and even a brief interview with N.K. Jemisin and Jamal Campbell, so you're definitely getting your money's worth. Thanks everybody for watching. Seems like even when I'm trying to take a break from Green Lantern, I still end up covering a Green Lantern comic. Figures. I've still got about a week or two planned of non-Green Lantern comics, then I should be back with Red Lanterns and the crossovers. So if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, or you just can't wait for me to get back to the New 52, or you just like to click lots of buttons, then be sure to click those like and subscribe buttons so you can be sure to be here next time, and I hope to see you then, right here, in the Comic Cave.